On the 28th of June 1914, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip stepped out of a delicatessen in Sarajevo and shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. The Archduke died within the hour. His wife Sophie died shortly after. Within 6 weeks, the world was at war. By the time it ended, 17 million people were dead. An entire generation of young men had been fed into trenches, artillery barrages, and poison gas attacks across a front line stretching hundreds of miles. 4 empires had collapsed. The map of the world had been redrawn. All of this, the history books often suggest, because of one man with a pistol on a street corner in Bosnia. But here's the part that doesn't quite add up. Assassinations happen. Leaders are killed. Political violence is not rare in history. And yet most assassinations, even of powerful figures, do not trigger world wars. So why did this one? The answer has nothing to do with the assassination itself. It has everything to do with the world that was waiting for an excuse. To understand what happened in the summer of 1914, you have to understand the system that had been building in Europe for decades. Europe in 1914 was a continent of empires, vast, competing, deeply suspicious of each other. Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia each controlled enormous territories and pursued conflicting interests across the continent and around the world. For decades, they had managed this tension through a network of alliances. The logic was simple. If every major power was tied to every other major power through mutual defense agreements, then attacking one nation would mean going to war with all of them. The alliances were meant to make war too costly to start. What nobody fully appreciated was that they had built a machine that, once triggered, could not be stopped. Germany had allied with Austria, Hungary, and Italy. France had allied with Russia. Britain was tied to France through informal agreements and to Belgium through a formal treaty of protection. The continent was divided into 2 great armed camps, each promising to fight if the other was attacked. All that was needed was a spark. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not inevitable, and it very nearly didn't happen. Gavrilo Princip was a member of a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand, which wanted to free Slavic peoples from Austro-Hungarian rule. On the morning of June 28th, the group had already failed once. An earlier attempt to throw a bomb at the Archduke's motorcade had misfired. The bomb bounced off the car and exploded under the vehicle behind it. The Archduke reached his destination unharmed. Princip, believing the mission had failed, went to a nearby delicatessen to eat something. The Archduke's motorcade, rerouted to visit the injured from the earlier attack, took a wrong turn. The driver stopped to reverse, directly in front of the delicatessen where Princip was standing. Princip stepped out and fired twice. The sequence of events that followed was almost a parody of miscalculation and lost opportunities. Austria-Hungary, enraged but uncertain, spent a month drafting an ultimatum to Serbia so deliberately harsh that it was designed to be rejected, giving Austria-Hungary the justification it needed to invade. Serbia accepted almost every demand. Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. Russia, bound by alliance and by its own ambitions in the Balkans, began mobilizing its enormous army in support of Serbia. Germany, alarmed by Russian mobilization on its eastern border, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, was drawn in. Germany, following a military plan called the Schlieffen Plan that required attacking France quickly before turning east, invaded Belgium. Britain, bound by treaty to protect Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. In 37 days, a political assassination in a small Balkan city had become a continental war. What followed was not the short, decisive war that almost everyone expected. Military planners on both sides had assumed a conflict would be over in months. Troops were sent to the front with promises they would be home by Christmas. Instead, the armies dug into the earth and stayed there for 4 years. The Western Front, a line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, became one of the most brutal environments in human history. Men lived in mud and water under constant artillery bombardment, emerging periodically to cross a few hundred meters of open ground called no man's land under machine gun fire. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 produced 60,000 British casualties on its first day alone. New weapons were deployed for the first time on a mass scale. Poison gas, tanks, aerial bombing. Technologies that would define the next century of warfare were tested and refined in the trenches of northern France. The war consumed everything. Economies were reorganized entirely around military production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Colonies around the world were drawn into a European conflict they had no part in starting. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany, collapsed under the pressure, and its collapse created borders and conflicts in the Middle East that have not been resolved to this day. By November 1918, when the armistice was finally signed, the scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. 17 million dead, 20 million wounded, entire populations of young men simply gone. A generation that would have built, governed, created, and led, consumed instead by 4 years of industrial warfare. And then the peace created the conditions for the next war. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed punishing conditions on Germany, enormous reparations, territorial losses, a clause assigning sole responsibility for the war to Germany. The economic humiliation that followed, combined with the global depression a decade later, created precisely the conditions in which extreme politics could thrive. 20 years after the armistice, Europe was at war again. So, what actually started the First World War? Not Gavrilo Princip. Not the assassination alone. The assassination was the spark. But a spark only starts a fire if the conditions are right. And the conditions in 1914 were catastrophically right. Decades of imperial competition had built up tensions that had no peaceful outlet. An arms race between Germany and Britain had created military machines that, once mobilized, were almost impossible to stop. Alliance systems that were meant to prevent war made it inevitable once any major power made a move. Military timetables took over from diplomatic judgment. Leaders who might have chosen negotiation found themselves swept along by forces they had built but could no longer control. The historian Barbara Tuchman, writing about the opening weeks of the war in her book The Guns of August, described it as a process in which the major powers walked into war sleepwalking. Not with intent, not with a plan for what would follow, but with a momentum that nobody had the will, the authority, or the time to stop. This morning, you probably didn't think about the First World War, but the world you live in was built on its wreckage. The borders of the Middle East, the structure of international institutions, the shape of European politics, the memory of industrial-scale destruction that makes modern leaders reluctant to start wars, all of it traces back in one way or another to a wrong turn on a street in Sarajevo. One driver took a wrong turn, one young man stepped out of a delicatessen, 2 shots were fired, and the world that existed before that moment, confident, imperial, certain of its own permanence, never came back. The next time something in the news feels small and contained and far away, Remember that June morning in 1914? The world didn't know it was about to end either.